If you're a coffee roaster with questions about how much coffee to put in your machine, keep watching. This is the first video in a 4-part series about batch size. I wrote an article for Roast Magazine's September-October issue about batch size, and these interviews were research for that article. Each of the coffee pros I interviewed had so much more information than I could fit into the written article, so I wanted to release the full interviews here on YouTube so you could learn everything they told me. In this first video, I talk batch size with Shelby Williamson, who is the 2019 US Roaster Champion and head roaster at Huckleberry Roasters in Denver. Shelby roasts on 2 machines, a 15-kilogram Giesen and a 70-kilogram Loring machine. And I love this interview because Shelby's a working roaster, so she gives practical advice and describes how she approaches batch size for her machines and her production operation. Shelby gives key insights into batch size, including adjusting roast weight to control the roast time, determining batch size based on inventory management, and much more. So without further ado, here's my interview with Shelby. Thank you, first of all, for joining me talking about batch sizes. You are at Huckleberry, so what machines do you roast on at Huckleberry?
So at Huckleberry, we kind of have a little bit of a different setup than a lot of places. We have a Loring 70 kilo, so that's definitely our workhorse. It does most of our roasting. And then I have a Giesen 15 kilo. So it's actually quite a big spread, yeah. But I actually, I had the opportunity to either keep our old ProBat, which was, I believe it's like a 25 kilo, I think. And or to keep the Giesen, and I actually elected to keep the Giesen for a few reasons. One is that it's just in my opinion a little bit better of a machine, because the UG was definitely a bigger machine, and it could do bigger batch sizes, but it also had a lot of things that needed to be fixed on it. And it also didn't have like a flame guard underneath, which we could have put in, but it just ended up tipping and facing coffee really easily unless you like drastically reduce the batch size. So rather than keep a bigger machine with a bigger footprint that, in my opinion, defected coffee unless I lowered the batch size, I kept the Giesen because I feel like that double wall steel drum really does a good job at roasting coffee with conductive heat. So that was kind of my choice. But it is kind of a weird setup because you have one machine that outputs 130 some pounds at a time, and you have one that outputs 20.
Yeah, right. What are the like minimum and maximum batch sizes that you use for each machine?
So yeah, for the Giesen, typically the least amount of coffee that I'm willing to put in that machine and like sell is 5 pounds. I've done a lot of work trying to dial in a 5-pound profile, which of course is always a little finicky because if you're trying to match a profile, you really have to reduce the airflow and the gas and in order to like match profiles. And the trick with the Giesen is that if you lower the airflow too much, the flame doesn't have enough oxygen, so it actually just snuffs. So that's kind of where I'm at on that. And then the max for the Giesen is 28 pounds. For me, with batch size, I think in general, batch size in itself is arbitrary, right? I say that a lot when I'm talking about roasting, is that like all of these numbers are really arbitrary. So like we need to talk about what's actually going on when we're making these changes, right? So for batch size, for me, I have a certain style of roasting that I like to adhere to for most of my coffees. Typically, like my single origins are between 8 and 10 minutes. That's a pretty big window, but 8 and 10 minutes is about where I keep my single origins. I like bright, fruity coffees. Even if they're my mild coffees, I try to highlight their acidity. And then we have coffees that are for blenders. They're a little darker. They're meant for espresso. Rather than take them really hot, really fast, I roast those a little bit slower. Those are more in the 10 to 13 minute range. I don't really roast anything over 13 minutes. That's just my style of roasting. There's nothing wrong if you do outside of that box. That's just what I do. So when I'm choosing batch sizes, for me, because I work in a production facility, I'm not in the stage where I'm a home roaster where every batch needs to be, I'm roasting, 3 pounds at a time, and it feels more like an art than production, right? That's a great place to be in. I envy people that that's their lifestyle, like that's a beautiful place to be in. But I'm running a production facility. I need to output as much coffee as physically possible without defecting it and with making it taste as good as it can. So when I'm choosing batch sizes, typically I'll choose them so that I can adhere to the time limits that I have set for myself on certain coffees. So, for example, I typically do 20 pounds for dense African coffees. It's on the lower end of the scale for the Giesen. I think it's at like 65% capacity or so, but I can push that coffee as fast or as slow as I want. That makes my life a little bit easier. Latin coffees that are single origin, I'm typically at 21 pounds. And that's just a starting point. Sometimes when I have a profile that I'm like, man, I really love this profile, but I wish I could slow it down, rather than trying to force it through the airflow and the gas, just because those both have exponential changes through the entire roast. If you lower gas at yellowing, it has an exponential change. For me, what I'll do is I'll add a pound into that batch size. So sometimes I will use batch size as a method of changing the way that something is roasting. I want to slow something down and I don't want to use my brain too hard. I just add a pound to the batch size. You know, I feel like it's super easy to do that, and I can output more coffee, so it's not a bad thing. Right now we have some single origin Brazils. They're a little bit less dense, which means they push faster. I can go a little heavier. Those are 23 pounds. And then our blenders are going to be in the 25 to 28 realm, because I want to keep those in the 11, 12 minute range. And if they're any lighter than that, they'll fly, and I just can't slow them down anyway. So putting more weight in the roaster to make it so that it's physically impossible for the roaster to push it faster is actually really helpful to me. The Giesen is really hard to defect coffee in general, like unless you are charging like crazy hot. So being able to open the gas all the way and let it just ride is not a big deal. It doesn't face it, doesn't tip it. So that's kind of how I manage the batch sizes on the Giesen. The Loring, however, is, I mean, I make choices very similarly on the Loring, but it's a totally different machine. Because it's mostly convective, not entirely, but mostly convective. Again, I need to output as much coffee as physically possible. So originally we were like, yeah, that's easy. We just cut the bag and that's the batch size, right? Columbia 77 kilo, and then, or yeah, the 70 kilo. And then like everything else is whatever the bag size is. However, what we found is that it was really hard to roast the way that I roast with 152 pounds in the machine. Like I couldn't get a roast under 13 minutes, and I was like charging it at like 500 degrees and going straight out with full gas, and I could not, and I wouldn't turn the gas down the entire roast, and I still just could not get it. And I would get tipping, obviously, because you're just blasting it with hot air. So that one we kind of decided, you know what, on our coffees for the Loring, we're going to go 132 pounds, because then for all of our African coffees, those can all still be one full bag, right? It's not a nightmare to like try to trim those down. It's just a full bag. Any Latin bags, we'll just have to trim some off. We'll throw it in a bucket so that the Giesen can use those coffees. So it works for our system because we have these buckets that the Giesen pulls out of. And then the Loring, we just stack a whole pallet of the coffees you'll be using that day. They cut the bags and weigh it out in the scale. But the main thing with the Loring is that it's really important that we actually have half batch sizes. One for our single origins, because I want to have complete control over those. So those we do half bag. So whatever the bag is, like Ethiopia, 66 pound. Colombia, 77 pounds. And then most Latins, 76, right? So for me, because I'm in a production facility, to some extent, it also has to be about being efficient as well as effective. So it's like I can effectively roast a 66 pound batch, and by doing a half bag rather than 80 pounds, when I'm loading my next pallet and I have another half batch, I have a half bag that's like all ready for me, right? The Loring is a little less, you know, the Giesen, I do a lot of variable batch sizes just to like try to get the roast to be correct. the loring is such a powerful machine that, like, for me, I'm like, the thing that makes the most sense is to do half bags. It makes inventory counting really easy. And then, yeah, it gives us the extras to throw into the Giesen batch. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I start with all of my coffees. And there's always room for breaking the rules. I think, it's always important to have like standards and starting points, but it's also important to be able to say, hey, like, that's not working for this coffee. We need to do something else.
Sure. And when you're doing a half batch, do you keep it on the same profile exactly, or do you decrease your roast time or increase your end temperature or vice versa, or do anything, or do you just keep it on the same profile?
Well, for the single origins, I only do half batch. And it's just because, like, again, I want full control over that coffee. I don't want to, if I mess up my between batch, which luckily with the loring is like pretty hard to do unless you're not paying attention. But if I mess up my between batch and I need to be able to catch that curve a little bit and just give it a little bit more hot air, the half batch really allows me to do that. For the full batches, we only do like our high volume coffees. So like our Bomb Senso, which is like our trade classic coffee. We do so much of that coffee that it makes sense for me to roast as much of it as I physically can at a time. But then at the end of the week, I might need to mitigate carryover. So I actually have two separate profiles, one half batch and one full batch. And I kind of do a combo of like the first time I'm programming a new half batch that has a full batch, what I will do is I will lay down the old profile, like the full profile, I guess. But also, like, when you have that dramatic of a difference in weight that's in the drum, in the chamber, I suppose, with the loring, the probes are going to read a little bit differently. Like, what I might finish at 140 for like our darker coffees in the full batch, it actually might be 130 or 435 in the half batch. So I mean, I use a combo of like trying to hit the same, markers of like hitting yellowing around the same time, hitting first crack around the same time, and then like visually checking the coffee as it comes out. That's kind of how I do it. The Giesen is a little bit harder to do profile matches on from variable batch size. So I typically just do not change the batch size. I'm lucky enough, again, to work in a high volume facility where it's like whatever's left at the end of the week, we bag it up and we send it to a program that we have called Coffee Club, which is like kind of, dedicated Huck customers who buy like $100 jar and you get 10 refills with it. And so you get cheaper coffee, but it's also a place for us to kind of like throw all of our extras. And so we still make profit on it, but it also helps us mitigate waste, which is really valuable in a big facility. So the only ones that I do like 5 pounds for would be things like decaf, where it's like I really don't want that hanging around, and there aren't a lot of dedicated specialty customers who are looking for decaf. It's not that there aren't any, it's just that there aren't
more and more.
Yeah. And then the other one would be like some of our special releases. Like I'm not going to throw a coffee that I'm selling for $52 a pound into Coffee Club. Like that's crazy, right? Like that kind of cheapens it. Even if we could break even on it, it's like, no, I want you to buy the nice special release. I don't want you to get it for cheap on the Coffee Club deal. So those ones I do really try to mitigate the carryover, and those ones I will do 5 pound roasts. When I'm changing the roast size, my starting point is usually what is the full batch? What is the partial batch? What's the percentage difference? So if this is a batch that is 1/4 of what a full batch is, I will reduce all of my metrics by 1/4, and I will reduce the charge to something that's like 100 degrees lower. Like that's a huge difference. And then typically I'll try to match time and processes, and then I'll go off of sight, smell, finish for the end of it. I don't typically set profiles for 5 pounds just because like it's very rare that I have to roast it. So usually that one I just roast like with something in the background and try to get it as close as possible. And I don't know, it works for me. So I mean, like usually on the cupping table, it tastes, the same as the big roast. So that's kind of how I do it.
Nice. How did you get to that point? Just like trial and error and like trusting your gut as a roaster?
I can't remember why we decided to roast 5 pounds for the first time. I think that like something happened. I can't remember why we did this, but like I was like, I don't know, like we could put
Might as
five
well
pounds,
try.
we could just try it. Like, I think that we knew that we were gonna have to roast like, oh, you know what? I do know what it was. Okay, so like years ago, we had a barista who was competing, and they were like, I bought this coffee and it's so great, and I want you to roast it. And there's like 20 pounds of it. And I was like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I know that you probably spent like $100 on this 20 pounds of coffee, you know? So I was like, I can't mess this coffee up. So they're like, well, we figured we could just like profile it. And I was like, I get like one shot at this coffee if I throw it in our roaster. And so then I was like, okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do 5 pounds. So I get 4 tries at it. And I'm going to like roast the first one. This is going to be our test. You'll come in, we'll cup it, we'll kind of discuss how it goes. But I kind of dialed it in based off of a sample roast I did of this coffee, so that I was like, okay, this is the type of coffee that it is. And then I took a coffee that was similar in our lineup and I made a 5 pound profile with that one. So I could just get like a basic 5 pound profile that was similar, ran it on this profile with the first 5 pounds. We tasted it. We made some adjustments. We roasted the next one, made some adjustments. The third one was actually like completely perfect. But of course, it's like a month out from the competition. So I was like, cool, we'll save this profile. And my job is going to be like with that last one, like I can't mess it up and I have to hit this 5 pound profile. So like once I realized that it was possible to roast 5 pounds well on a machine, obviously you can turn coffee brown at any increment, but to roast with some control, the probes read relatively not normal, they read really low actually comparatively, because the probe is taking the temperature of the bean mass and the probe itself, right? So if you have less coffee, there's typically a little more air, the probe is typically a little more exposed, and there's less bean mass that's covering it. So it makes sense that you would get readouts of, you know, usually I'd get first crack at 385, and on this one I got it at like 365. So it just like completely changes the way that it reads it. But yeah, like I've had some pretty relative success with like the smallest batch I do on the loring is probably like 50 pounds, because below that you really start to lose the ability to like accurately take temperature, and the probe is just like
Yeah. Talk about
what am I even looking at this point?
Yeah.
You know, like, but yeah,
Cool.
oh, that's kind of how I go about it. And yeah, like I said, because it's a production facility, it's like I don't want to have roast where if I blast it with 100% gas, I still can't reach my goals. The loring 132 pounds seems to be like enough that I can get as much coffee out as quickly as possible, but still stick within my parameters of like trying to make sure that like I'm roasting it the way I want to roast it.
Yeah.
On occasion, like if it's a Thursday, because we don't roast on Fridays, so it's my last roast day, and I've got, you know, 100 pound, or not 100, like let's say 80 pounds that I need of one coffee, and my normal batch size is like 70 pounds. It's like, I'm just gonna add 10 pounds into this and like roast it and like try to match the profile with the same thing, and like increase the air a little bit on the reloring and try to get it to match. But I really don't mess with the batch profiling as much as like the batch size. I pretty much just like set it, and then that's it. And then once I've finished dialing it in, that's the batch size. Because like coffee is so subjective. Like, you know, my dad loves McCafe, and you know what? It's really consistent. So I think that that's part of it. It's like it tastes the way he wants it to taste every single time. So when I'm roasting, like as much as, you know, I do roast a lot to my own flavor profile, it's even more important, especially with our darker roast, that it is consistent, that it tastes the exact same every single time, because people who buy coffee at the grocery store, they buy the same bag over and over and over again. And the second that there's like the tiniest thing off, they know. Specialty coffee drinkers, they're always looking for a new adventure, right? So like I don't think it really bothers them that it's not consistent.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, people who are buying single
Grocery.
origins, it's like I want new stuff, I want something different, I want, you know, I want change. But like I would say it's just like it'd be the same thing with like beer. Like people who drink craft are always looking for unique, different innovation and people who drink, you know, like Bud Light or whatever. It's like, if you switched their Bud Light with Coors, they would know.
They'd be pissed.
Like, they would know. Like, even if it was in the same can, they would know that something was wrong. And so for me with coffee, consistency is one of the most important things you can do. And the less that you mess with the variables, which batch size is one of the biggest variables, the more consistent coffee that you're going to have and the more successful you're going to be. Smaller roasteries don't always have that luxury. Sometimes you have 12 pounds for the entire week of one coffee, and you cannot have carryover because it will kill your margins. So I understand that that's a thing, right? But for me personally, I'm just really spoiled, and I can roast, you know, 132 pounds at a time and find a home for it and not have to worry too much.
Yeah.
But
Awesome. Kind of talking about on the cupping table, and you mentioned that the parameters specifically on the Giesen, you start some with 20 to 21 pounds and some 24, 25, 26. What would you notice on the cupping table that would make you adjust the batch size?
Okay, so I think that Brazil is a really good example. Like, I started at 21 pounds for our single origin Brazil. It's a natural process, but more in the terms of like a African natural process, right? It's like actually fruity. It's not just a Brazil natural that's nutty and is filler coffee. It's really, really sweet. It's super juicy, and it tastes much more like a single origin should taste. I started it at 21 pounds because I was like, it's a Latin coffee. We'll start at 21 pounds, see where that goes. One of the things that was really missing out of that coffee that we had in the sample was this like fudgy mouthfeel characteristic that I really loved because it tasted like chocolate covered cherries, right? Like, it had all of the fruit of the natural that you wanted, but the mouthfeel was really hollow. So for me, in my roasting philosophy, and again, I say that like in my roasting philosophy, in my head, longer coffees are going to give you thicker bodies. Sometimes the body is not good. Sometimes it's really thick and it's really like gritty, but it's not pleasant. So like it doesn't mean that it's going to be better. It just means that I'm trying to increase the intensity of the body. So therefore I need to develop it a little bit slower, a little bit longer. I don't want to go too hot and lose all of the fruit that's in that really nice natural, right? So lower and slower was my goal. Instead of, you know, trying to be like, well, I'll charge it lower and then I'll charge it with less gas and then I'll hit it with this. I just added 2 pounds to the batch size. I did the exact same gas adjustment. And I think I increased the airflow just a little bit since I was increasing the batch size, and it slowed the roast down. And I just did the exact same batch changes at the same temperatures, and it added like 30 seconds to the batch or so without, I didn't have to worry about killing it at the end because I misjudged how much gas I was going to use. Like, I didn't have to worry about charging it too hot and damaging the coffee because I'd already found a successful temperature that could charge it that wouldn't damage the softer Brazilian coffee. Adding 2 pounds was just like a really brain dead way to lengthen the coffee's total roast time.
Oh,
And
that's
slow
so brilliant. That's not brain dead. That's like circumventing all
I
of
think
the
it's like a circle,
overthinking.
you know what I mean? Where it's just like there's brain dead, and then there's like it's brilliant, and
Brilliance.
it's like kind of come all the way back around that it's so stupid that it's smart, right?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the simplest solution can be the most effective.
Yeah, and I mean, like, that was one of the biggest things. Like, when I was training my new production roaster that we have, she's never roasted before, which was one of the reasons that I wanted to hire her, because I was like, great, I don't have to like untrain you.
Fresh blood.
Because even if like you're a great roaster in what you do, you've come to my facility where we roast the way that I roast, and I need to not be fighting you all the time, right? So whenever we were talking about like dialing in a new machine, it was always about like, keep it simple, stupid. Like, that was like our thing. It was like, don't overcomplicate this. We can talk about the chemistry behind it later. We don't have to talk about that right now. Keep it super simple. Like, if you have a solution, it's not going to be that like you modulate airflow up and down the entire time through the entire roast. Like, we want to do everything as simple as possible with as few touches as possible, because we want to make fewer mistakes. The less you touch it, the fewer mistakes you're going to make, right? And so like that's just like an easy way to like make fewer mistakes. I'm not worried about like killing this roast too, because I have gas. I have sufficient gas that I know will cover the entire roast. Add 2 pounds, it'll obviously slow it down because it'll be the same amount of energy applied to a higher mass, and it'll slow the coffee down. Like, we don't have to overcomplicate this, right? It's not rocket science.
Yeah. And as far as consistency, I feel like that can only, like, the number of times you touch it being fewer can only increase consistency, because, you know, what if you did 20 different adjustments, the coffee turned out great, but you can't replicate that, or you don't know which one of those adjustments led to the coffee tasting really great or roasting really well. Or
for sure, I'm all about one change. Like, that's always like, if you want to learn, you need to make one change, because otherwise you really just can't track down what it came down to. Like a previous production roaster that I had, Kyle Rowling, who came from Strava, who is a great roaster. When he saw my profiles, he was like, you only changed the gas 3 times. And I was like, yeah.
Are you even a roaster?
I was like, yeah, that's like the point, man. He was like, well, no, like, you need to like finesse. And he liked, you know, like, not that he liked, but he had been taught that like, at the end, it's like down by half a bar, down by half a bar, and you just like peter the ending out. But I was like, why would I do that when I could keep the gas like just a little hotter, a little longer, and then like cut it more significantly and let it ride out the finish? Fewer changes. If I get distracted, it's not as much of an issue. Like, I have a lot of other things going on while I'm roasting. So it's like, I don't have to make 10 adjustments at the end and finesse it. I make 1 adjustment. And that just, again, goes with my consistency philosophy. It's like, if you're between batches good and you hit your first gas, and there's only 3 more gas adjustments after that, like, you have time to cut bags, you have time to, you know, go to the bathroom. That's like our bathroom break is between first gas and yellowing. Like you have time to do all that stuff, and you're not so strapped to the machine. You make fewer mistakes, and it just makes roasting a lot less stressful when it's not like, I'm trying to scoop out my next batch, but then I'm also trying to make changes, and I'm like doing all these things. Right. It's just a lot less stressful. So it's like, you know, we can have a much more like calm roasting style. Yeah. Like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to finesse them. That's fine. That's your roasting philosophy. I personally just don't want to do that and think that it's unnecessary. So I don't do it.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Have you noticed that different batch sizes will affect different coffees, like towards the end of the roast, either like mitigate them taking off at the end of the roast, or like prevent them from crashing?
Sure. So like, for example, the 5-pound roast doesn't have very much mass in the drum, right? So let's say I put heat into it and we're at first crack, and then I kill it. That coffee has no mass to carry itself through, like no heat that's retained within the mass of the coffee. There's more airflow just because there's more space in the drum. If you kill that gas, that coffee just dies. There's no momentum built in that gas. That's roasting much more like me pushing it this way, versus the full size batch of our special release coffee, which I do 17 pounds for special release, just for a few reasons. 1, so I can push it any way I want. And 2, because we just don't sell as much of it. So it's important to keep the carryover tight. So I do 17 pounds. But like, that's a huge difference, right? So like, even if I was at first crack on the full batch, if I cut the gas at first crack, there would still be momentum in the coffee itself from the heat that I've put into it. And it would carry itself some of the way. I mean, it'd probably still also die, but it would carry itself much, much further. I mean, there are a bunch of different factors that affect the way that roasts, but I would say in general, the more mass that you have and you've hit first crack, the more it's going to carry itself through. But then you have to start asking questions about like, well, how much airflow have you been applying throughout? If you had high airflow at the very beginning of the roast, your roast will be hotter to start, but you've actually been pulling heat out of the drum the entire time. So it has less conductive heat and radiant heat that's going to carry it forward, right? So even if you've got this crazy, crazy hot, heavy roast that you've been putting high airflow through, if you kill it, it'll die because it has no retained heat. All of the heat is heat that you're applying in the moment. Versus like, if I have a smaller batch of dense Ethiopia, like a 20-pound batch, and I did low airflow at the beginning and high heat at the beginning, and I let it ride with low airflow, all of that heat is still retained in the drum and in the coffee itself. So if I kill it at first crack, it's still just going to shoot off into space, right? So it's not just a batch size thing, but I would say like if we were to talk like medium airflow, no changes to it whatsoever across the board, the higher batch coffee is typically going to carry itself a little bit further because there's going to be a little less airflow in the drum itself, and there's going to be a little more radiant heat bean to bean, and there's going to be a little more conductive heat held in the drum versus the smaller batches. So
Nice.
the loring is a little bit of a different beast just because like there is conductive heat, but I mean, if I take the burner to 20%, which is the lowest that you're allowed to on a 70, that coffee will be like, like it'll just die. So like that one's a little different. Things don't typically take off the way that they do in a drum roaster as they do in the loring. But I also think that like the Giesen creates a little bit more dynamic coffee sometimes because like the color reading spread is a little bit bigger because instead of being like really forceful with the air like the loring is that shoves heat into the center of the bean, we have coffee that's roasting from the outside in. And so your exterior is always going to be a touch darker than your interior, more so than on the loring. So now we're into this territory where you can create like, especially with like the East Africans, we can create like really nice fruity acidic coffees that have like dried spicy fruit chocolate notes as well. The loring, it's like I can make anything taste super, super acidic, but I cannot get that dynamic coffee the way that I can in the drum roaster.
Yeah. Cool.
But
nice. Yeah, I have at Black and White have 3 different sizes of the lorings, and I've like the 3 machines do very different things if you cut them to 20% at the end of the roast, like, and depending on the batch size, but like the 15 kilogram, especially with some of our experimentally processed coffees that have lower densities and things, like you can cut you can cut the burner to 20% and they will still just like fly off like into space. And
so, I mean, I wonder how much of that has to do with like the percentage of your batch weight to like the actual size of the drum, not just the like capacity, right? It's like how much more or less air is in there.
Right, for sure. Yeah. And it's interesting to see the difference in the 3 machines all being the same manufacturer, but yeah, they do different things. Yeah, we're with the 70, similar to what you said, if I cut it to 20%, no matter what the coffee, it will just like, it'll tank, like fall off. So
yeah. Do you guys do full bags?
We do like kind of like you do 130, 135, I think is like our pounds is our heaviest batch that we'll do on that. Cause similarly, if we put more than that, it just takes 16, 17 minutes. And we don't have any production roasts that we want to roast that long for us anyway. Like you said, different people
scoop your 70s, or do you? So I have a solution for you, by the way. I've been watching your Instagrams and I'm like scooping like a full bag into that. So there are pallet jacks that are specifically made that you can jack them up to like shoulder height. So what we do is we have these bottomless pallets that you can get online or whatever. So they have bottomless pallets. You build the pallet in the order that you're going to roast it. Like, so let's say you need to roast like 2 Brazil, 2 Latin, blah, 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 all the way up top. You just stack them in the reverse order that you want to roast them. You wheel it over with this pallet jack and you just cut it in straight into the scale. And then as the day goes on, you jack it up and it'll jack it all the way up so that it can always be above the height of the scale.
Yeah. That's a really good idea. I mean, I'll request that.
Let me just flex on that. I see that. And I'm like, her elbow must hurt. So my elbows hurt and I don't even scoop anymore. Like
I've been thinking about doing like a series on Instagram of basically like, here are my scooping hacks so you don't end up with back pain every single day.
Yeah, get rid of the scoop and get one of these pallet jacks. They're not really that expensive in the realm of pallet jacking. And honestly, it'll save you so much time. Like scooping an entire bag. I mean, I'm sure you scoop half of it and then pick it up and dump it in, right? I'm guessing that's kind of how that goes. Yeah, instead of doing that, it'll take you just like literally cut it, cut the zip ties and dump it in.
Yeah.
And then, you know, maybe top it off with whatever you need from,
Right.
yeah, from your smaller buckets. But yeah, no, you should
Send me that in.
stop scooping. Terrible.
I mean, how else am I going to get
So strong. Yeah.
Yeah.
4 pounds at a time. That's just,
Yep.
I feel like my wrists take the biggest brunt from scooping. It's not, yeah, I was like, it's just, they get so like tired and sore, and I already had surgery on one of them for carpal tunnel, which I'm sure that had something to do with it.
Well, I have at least 6 tricks that I've written down, so I'll share those on Instagram sometime, and then I'll get the pallet jack, and those tips can.
They can just go be
yeah,
people, not
yeah, right.
anymore.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that I have about batch size. Unless, is there anything else that you want to add about batch size, either how you do it at Huck, how you've seen other people do it?
I mean, I've seen people do the full gamut of like, I roast exactly how much I need. They use the auto roast. I don't really do any automatic roasting at Huckleberry, mostly because I don't know if I'm just like skeptical. I'm not really sure why. But like, also I think that like, it's really important that, you know, especially when I'm training a new roaster, that she actually knows how to roast coffee. But the other thing is that like, if I'm always chasing a perfect profile, like upkeeping the automated roasting on the Loring is like a full-time job. So it's less work for me just to manually roast everything and reset them on Cropster. But I mean, I have seen people use that audit, like they use the profile roast and then they're like, oh, I'm using, you know, 78% of batch size. And then the machine will like keep it on track. I've seen it. I haven't done a lot of extensive cupping over it, but yeah, I mean, with me, batch size is like pretty, it's just one component to the entire equation, right? And so like, for me, keeping it consistent is what's most important when it comes to like keeping consistent roasts and consistent coffees. Overall, it's pretty arbitrary. Like if having a 16-minute batch is how you do things, then that's totally fine. Load it up, have a heavy roast fewer batches, go home early. Like, you know, like, or I don't know if it'd be early because you're adding roast time, but like, if you want to slow down your batch or your total time, add more coffee, let that slow it down. Like it's a really good tool to use as well, like just shaping roast. So I wish I could slow it down during this, you know, blah blah blah. Oh great, add a pound, see how it goes. You know, it's just one of the many tools that you have at your disposal to change. Like I've had coffees where it's like, oh, no matter what I do, I can't slow it down. Like I lower the batch, I lower this, blah blah, the coffee just like takes off and I can't stop it. Make it heavier, make the machine work harder. Like you're gonna like do something, you know. Like I think it's just one of the many tools that you can use to shape the roast how you want to shape. I don't think that there's like anything inherently good or bad about like a batch size, or I don't necessarily follow the rule like you have to use 70% of batch capacity. You know, like everyone always talked about like Loring was, oh yeah, you can, the full capacity is actually a full bag. You can cut a full bag and roast it. You can. I don't like coffee that comes off of a full Colombian batch, like a dense coffee that was roasted real slow. I don't like it. So I'm going to roast the way I want to roast. I need to cut 20 pounds out of that. Like,
awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been super interesting. I'm like, I had, never thought about the add a pound to slow the thing down. That's a really great tool, a trick to try next time I'm working on it.
Yeah, no, it's just one really easy way just to be like, just do the exact same thing. Now just add a pound. Like it's very easy. I'm all about.
And when you're doing that, I think you mentioned, you make the like same adjustments based on the temperature of the coffee, not the time. So like if you went from 100% to 80% at 4 minutes and 220 degrees, whatever, you would make that same adjustment at 220 degrees, not at 4 minutes.
Yeah, because typically processes happen at temperatures in coffee and not so much at time. And I mean temperature, like obviously relative, because everybody's temperatures are going to be different. But if I'm roasting the same profile, that's just kind of how I roast. The only thing that I ever make based on time, like a very specific time, is the very first gas adjustment. Like charge the coffee, make the first gas adjustment, and then everything from that point forward, I make on temperature. Within reason, obviously. If I'm like slow and then I don't want to go way over time, but like on profile, we should be making stuff. I make stuff at temperature because I find that it helps correct little inconsistencies within the coffee, because I'm not constantly like going a little early or a little late. I'm going at the same time or the same temperature as that process is happening, and then it helps correct it back onto the path, essentially. So that's just how I have learned to control the roast. It's the easiest for me, you know?
Yeah.
And most consistent.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, thank you, Shelby.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Shelby, for that great interview. And thank you for watching. If you have other questions about batch size, put them in the comments below or write one key takeaway that you had from this interview. As I said, this is the first in a 4-part series about batch size. The next interview will be with Scott Rao, so stay tuned for that and check back next week. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button so you get a notification the next time I upload another video. And make sure to get the September-October issue of Roast Magazine for the full article on batch size. Thanks for watching. Cheers.